Matt Collins had never been one for suburban life. He wasn't the type to chat with neighbors over white picket fences or attend barbecues where everyone pretended to like each other while secretly competing over who had the greener lawn. He had spent most of his life in big cities, moving from one place to another, never staying anywhere long enough to care about the politics of homeowners associations or the nosy tendencies of middle-aged busybodies who made it their mission to control every aspect of their communities. When he finally bought a house in what he thought was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, it wasn't because he suddenly yearned for the camaraderie of suburban living. It was because he was done with the chaos of city life, the constant noise, the endless traffic, and the feeling that he was constantly surrounded by people yet entirely alone. He wanted space, quiet, and the simple luxury of being left the hell alone. His house was a modest but comfortable single-story home with a large backyard, one of the main reasons he had chosen it. He didn't care much for fancy landscaping or meticulously arranged flower beds, but he did appreciate having a private outdoor space where he could sit in the evenings, crack open a beer, and enjoy the fresh air without feeling like he was trapped in a concrete jungle. The first few weeks in his new home were exactly what he had hoped for. The neighbors kept to themselves for the most part, and he did the same. There were occasional greetings exchanged when he passed someone on the street while jogging, and he had met a couple of people in passing, mostly retirees, who seemed content to ignore him, as long as he did the same. He figured that was a good thing. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged into whatever social dynamics existed within the neighborhood. Then he met Karen. Or rather, Karen made sure he knew who she was. It happened on a warm Friday evening, one of those rare moments when Matt actually allowed himself to unwind. Work had been relentless that week, and all he wanted was to sit in his backyard, enjoy a cold beer, and let the tension melt away. He had just settled into his patio chair, stretching his legs out, when he heard the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat. Loudly. Intentionally. He turned his head toward the source of the sound and found himself looking at a woman standing just beyond the fence that separated his yard from the next property. She was in her late 50s, with short, precisely styled blonde hair, wearing a pastel-colored blouse that looked like it had been ironed to perfection. Her lips were pursed into a tight, disapproving line, and her arms were crossed over her chest as she stared at him like he had just committed some unforgivable sin. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to being listened to. "Are you aware that alcohol is not allowed in outdoor spaces within our community?" Matt blinked. He wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly at first. "What?" Karen exhaled sharply, as if the mere act of repeating herself was an inconvenience. "Alcohol. It's against the community guidelines to consume it outside. You're going to have to take that inside." Matt stared at her for a moment, then slowly looked down at the bottle of beer in his hand. He wasn't being loud. He wasn't disturbing anyone. He wasn't throwing a party or blasting music. He was sitting in his own backyard, on his own property, drinking a single beer. His first instinct was to laugh, but he could tell by the rigid way Karen held herself that she wasn't joking. "I'm in my yard," he said, stating the obvious. "Yes, and your yard is part of the community," Karen replied smoothly, as if that explained everything. "We have rules here for a reason. I'm sure you were given a copy of the guidelines when you moved in." Matt sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had no patience for this. "Look, lady." Karen, she corrected him with an air of self-importance. "I'm the neighborhood compliance officer. It's my responsibility to ensure that everyone adheres to the standards we've set for our community." "Right," Matt muttered. "Well, Karen, I'm just sitting here minding my own business, not bothering anyone. So if you don't mind." "I do mind," Karen interrupted, her voice sharp, "and I will have to report this. We take violations seriously." Matt exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together to keep from saying something he might regret. He could already tell what kind of person she was, one of those people who thrived on having power over others, no matter how small or insignificant that power was. He had dealt with her type before, the kind who made it their life's mission to police everything and everyone around them because it gave them a sense of control. "Go ahead and report it," he said finally, lifting the beer bottle in an exaggerated toast before taking a deliberate sip. Knock yourself out." Karen's expression darkened, and for a split second Matt thought she might actually reach over the fence and snatch the bottle out of his hand. But instead she straightened her posture, lifted her chin, and pulled out her phone. "Well," she said with forced politeness, "if you're going to be difficult about this, I'll have to take alternative measures." Matt rolled his eyes, turning his attention back to the setting sun. "Do whatever you feel you need to do, Karen." He heard her huff in indignation before marching off. He figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights lit up the front of his house. Matt frowned, setting his beer down and getting up to check what was happening. As he walked toward his front door, he saw 2 police officers standing near their patrol car. His stomach sank. He had an eerie feeling he knew exactly why they were there. He opened the door, stepping outside. "Evening, officers. Can I help you?" One of the officers, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, glanced at a notepad before looking at Matt. "We received a call about a potential disturbance. Neighbor reported a man drinking in public and acting disorderly." Matt exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I was drinking a beer in my backyard. That's it." The second officer, a younger guy who looked barely out of training, glanced toward the house. "Your backyard?" "Yeah," Matt said, already feeling exhausted by the conversation. "My private property." The older officer looked vaguely annoyed, probably realizing they had been called out for nothing. He sighed and nodded. "Right, doesn't sound like an issue. Apologies for the inconvenience." Before they turned to leave, Matt glanced toward the neighboring house. The curtains in Karen's front window twitched slightly. She was watching. He gritted his teeth, already knowing this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Matt should have known that Karen wouldn't let things go that easily. Women like her never did. The moment the cops left his driveway that night, he could already feel the storm brewing, an unshakable certainty that this was just the beginning of a much bigger headache. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs. People like Karen didn't get satisfaction from being told no, they took it as a personal challenge. And if there was one thing Matt had no patience for, it was playing games with someone who had nothing better to do with their life than dictate how others should live theirs. He had hoped that the police visit would serve as a reality check for her, that she would realize she was wasting everyone's time, but as he stood on his porch watching the squad car disappear down the street, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. Across the way, Karen stood by her front window, her silhouette visible behind the sheer curtains. She was watching him. The next morning, Matt found an envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name written in sharp, precise letters. He already knew who it was from before he even opened it. Inside was a printed notice, the kind that was probably spit out of some outdated community association office printer. The language was formal, overly polite in a way that only made it more infuriating. "Dear Mr. Collins, it has come to our attention that you have engaged in behavior that is in direct violation of our community standards. As per the guidelines outlined in your welcome packet, the consumption of alcoholic beverages in outdoor spaces is strictly prohibited. This letter serves as an official warning. Repeated violations may result in fines or further action as deemed necessary by the association board. We encourage you to adhere to the established rules to maintain harmony within our neighborhood." Matt let out a dry laugh, shaking his head as he folded the letter and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. He had half a mind to walk over to Karen's house, knock on her door, and tell her exactly where she could shove her official warning, but he knew that was exactly the kind of reaction she wanted. She wanted him angry, wanted to provoke him into an outburst so she could run crying to the board or the police again and play the victim. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, he decided to ignore it. Let her waste her time filing complaints. He wasn't breaking any actual laws, and as far as he was concerned, she could throw all the paper tantrums she wanted. He wouldn't be entertaining them, but ignoring Karen wasn't enough. That night, as Matt pulled into his driveway after a long day, something immediately felt off. It took him a moment to realize what it was, but as soon as he stepped out of his car, he saw it. Trash. pieces of paper, plastic wrappers, and an empty fast food bag scattered across his front lawn. At first, he thought maybe some raccoons had gotten into someone's garbage and the wind had carried it over, but as he got closer, he saw that the mess was too deliberate. The trash wasn't scattered randomly, it was placed. The wrappers were weighted down with small rocks, as if someone had made sure they wouldn't blow away before he could see them. Someone wanted him to know this was intentional. Karen. His jaw tightened as he exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. This was a petty move, juvenile at best, and the logical part of his brain told him to just clean it up and move on. But another part of him, the part that didn't take kindly to being messed with, wanted to march over to her house and dump the trash right onto her perfectly manicured lawn. He settled for the first option, not because he was taking the high road, but because he knew this was just step one in whatever game she was playing. He wasn't going to react until he had something solid to use against her. The next morning, a second letter arrived. Another warning. This time, it accused him of failing to maintain the cleanliness of his property, citing a section of the community guidelines that required all residents to keep their yards free of debris and litter. Matt almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. Karen had manufactured a problem just so she could slap him with another warning. It was calculated, a move designed to frustrate him into compliance. But compliance to what? That was the part he still didn't understand. What did she actually want? For him to leave? To bend the knee and acknowledge her authority? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about a beer in his backyard. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules for the sake of order, she was enforcing them for the sake of power. She needed control, and Matt was a loose thread in the tapestry she had spent years weaving. He decided to talk to a few of the other neighbors, get a feel for whether this was something that only he was dealing with, or if Karen had a habit of policing the entire street like some self-appointed sheriff. Most of them were hesitant to speak, offering vague, non-committal responses when he asked about the association's enforcement habits. But one man, an older guy named Tom who lived a few houses down, gave him a look that said he knew exactly what Matt was dealing with. "She's been like this for years," Tom muttered, keeping his voice low as they stood by their mailboxes. "Most people just keep their heads down, follow the rules, and don't make waves. But every now and then, someone moves in who doesn't fit her mold, someone who doesn't bow to her little kingdom. And that's when the problems start." Matt frowned. "So what happens to those people?" Tom exhaled, shaking his head. "They leave. Sooner or later, they always leave. Either they get fed up with the fines and the harassment, or they start having real problems. Inspections, noise complaints, mysterious violations. Some of them swear things started happening to their property: car tires slashed, sprinklers mysteriously broken. Nothing that could ever be traced back to her, of course, but enough to make life miserable." Matt let that sink in. He had dealt with difficult people before, but this was something else entirely. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was playing the long game, and she had an entire system behind her to make sure she always won. "Let me guess," Matt said dryly. "No one's ever fought back." Tom gave a hollow chuckle. "You don't fight people like her, son. You outlast them, or you get out of their way." But Matt wasn't interested in waiting for Karen to get bored and move on to her next target. He wasn't going to roll over, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let her run him out of his own home. If she wanted a fight, she had picked the wrong guy. The next day, Matt installed security cameras around his property. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he would be ready. If there were more trash dumps, more violations, more mysteriously escalating issues, he would have proof of exactly who was behind them. He wasn't just going to endure her nonsense, he was going to document every single move she made. That night, he sat on his porch with another beer, looking straight toward Karen's house as he took a slow, deliberate sip. "Let's see what you do next, lady." Matt had known from the beginning that Karen wasn't going to let this go, but he hadn't expected her to escalate this quickly. The property inspection stunt had been her way of trying to show him that she had power, that she could make his life miserable with bureaucratic nonsense and official-looking documents. But when that failed, when he didn't fold like she expected him to, she had moved on to something more underhanded. He had expected fines, more letters, maybe even another visit from the police, but he hadn't expected her to start sending people onto his property in the middle of the night. The broken glass, the threatening note, those weren't just warnings. They were declarations of war. But if Karen thought intimidation tactics were going to work on him, she had severely miscalculated. Matt had dealt with worse than petty suburban tyrants, and if she was trying to push him out, she had picked the wrong man to mess with. He spent the next morning securing his property. The cameras he had installed were already good, but he upgraded the angles, repositioned a few, and made sure they covered every vulnerable spot. He reinforced the locks on his fence gates, added motion-sensitive floodlights near the back, and even placed a few discreet noise sensors along the perimeter. If anyone so much as stepped onto his lawn without his permission again, he would know. Then, he started digging. If Karen wanted to play games, he needed to understand exactly how far her influence reached. He wasn't interested in fighting blind. He went through public records, searching for complaints, lawsuits, or anything that tied her to shady tactics. And while there was nothing outright damning, there was a pattern: people moving in, people moving out. Too many houses in the community had been bought and sold within a suspiciously short time frame, some after only a year or two. That wasn't normal for a suburban neighborhood. People usually settled in for the long haul, but here, the turnover rate was too high to be a coincidence. Matt started talking to people, and at first most of them were reluctant to say anything. Some acted like they barely knew Karen, brushing off his questions with polite smiles and vague answers. Others lowered their voices, glanced over their shoulders before speaking, as if they were afraid that simply acknowledging the problem would make them the next target. And then there were the ones who talked. A man down the street, retired, widowed, told him that he had been fined so many times for minor infractions that he had eventually just given up and paid thousands of dollars in penalties, even though half of them were bogus. A younger couple admitted that they had been pressured into repainting their house 3 times in a single year because it didn't match the aesthetic guidelines, even though other homes had the exact same colors. A woman who had lived there for over a decade confessed that she had watched 3 different families pack up and leave under mysterious circumstances, all of them citing stress, harassment, and endless citations for nonsense violations. Karen had been systematically driving people out, and the worst part was that no one had ever stopped her. Matt knew why. Fear. Not of physical violence, not of anything that would make the news, but the kind of fear that settled into your daily life, grinding you down little by little until you were too exhausted to keep fighting. Constant fines, false complaints, property devaluations, and endless bureaucracy. She didn't need to threaten people outright, she just had to make them feel like staying wasn't worth it. And now she was trying to do the same thing to him. That night, Matt sat on his porch, waiting. He had no proof that Karen had sent the person who vandalized his fence, but he didn't need proof to know it was her doing. He wasn't stupid. And he also knew she would try again. So when his cameras alerted him to movement in his yard, he was already prepared. A shadow moved along the fence line, creeping low, trying to stay out of sight. But the motion sensors caught them, the floodlights snapping on in an instant, bathing the entire yard in harsh white light. The figure froze. Matt stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed, watching as the intruder, a man, mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, stood there, caught like a rat in a trap. "Something I can help you with?" Matt's voice was calm, steady, not the least bit surprised. The man hesitated, glancing toward the street like he was considering making a run for it. Matt took a step forward. "I'd think carefully about your next move. I've got 4 different cameras recording you right now, and if you so much as move in the wrong direction, that footage is going straight to the police." The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He wasn't just some random thug. He was nervous, unsure. He hadn't expected to be caught. And then, in a low voice, he said, "I was just supposed to leave something." Matt narrowed his eyes. "Let me guess. A bottle, a note, maybe another little warning." The man didn't answer. Matt shook his head. "Tell Karen she's getting sloppy." That did it. The man flinched, his face twisting in something between guilt and frustration. But Matt didn't care about his excuses. "Get the hell off my property," Matt said, voice firm. "And if I see you or anyone else here again, I won't be so polite next time." The man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, disappearing down the street. Matt exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He hadn't expected Karen to send someone again so soon, but it didn't matter. She had made her move, and now it was his turn. The next morning, Matt made a call. Not to the police. He knew they wouldn't do much with so little direct evidence. No, he called a lawyer. Someone who specialized in property disputes and wrongful harassment. Someone who could help him do what no one else had done before, fight back with actual legal consequences. Karen had gotten away with her tactics for too long because no one had ever put real pressure on her. But Matt wasn't just another name on a list, another resident who would roll over and leave. He wasn't going anywhere. And this time, Karen was going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose. Matt had spent his life handling problems head-on, but there was something different about this. This wasn't a confrontation he could settle with a single decisive move, not a fight where one good hit would end things. This was slow, insidious, a war of attrition designed to drain him, to make him doubt whether any of this was worth it. Karen wasn't coming at him directly, and that was what made her dangerous. She wasn't the type to get her hands dirty. She worked through systems, through loopholes, through technicalities and rules that had just enough legal backing to be a nightmare to challenge. She had built a fortress of bureaucracy, and the only way to beat someone like that was to start dismantling it from the inside. He had spent the last few days reinforcing his property, making sure no one could step foot on his land without him knowing about it. The cameras had already paid off once when they caught the man sneaking around his fence, and now Matt had hard evidence that Karen wasn't just some overzealous neighborhood busybody. She was orchestrating something. Whether it was harassment, intimidation, or a deliberate attempt to drive him out, it didn't matter. The fact that she was willing to send people in the dead of night to mess with his property told him that this wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was personal. He started digging deeper, going through everything he could find about Karen and her grip on the community. The association's bylaws were intentionally convoluted, a maze of legal jargon that made it nearly impossible to tell what was actually enforceable and what was just posturing. But buried in the mess of rules and regulations, Matt found something interesting, a clause stating that board members could be legally removed if they were found guilty of abuse of power, manipulation, or intimidation of residents. It was vague, and he knew the process would be anything but simple, but it was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And a crack was all he needed. The more he talked to his neighbors, the more he realized just how long Karen had been playing this game. Some were reluctant to speak, their eyes darting around as if saying the wrong thing might bring some unseen consequence down on them. Others, the ones who had been through the worst of her games, were more willing to share their stories. A retired couple who had been fined into submission, a single mother who had been repeatedly accused of violations she never committed, a man who had been slapped with noise complaints simply because his dog barked twice in a day. And then there were the ones who had left the families who had packed up and moved after months, sometimes years, of constant battles with Karen and her relentless enforcement of rules that seemed to exist solely to drive people away. Patterns began to emerge, clear, undeniable connections between who stayed and who left, between who was quietly tolerated and who became a target. Karen didn't just go after people at random. She focused on the ones she couldn't control. The independent types, the ones who didn't fall in line, the ones who didn't play along with the charade of community harmony she had built around herself. If someone wasn't willing to bend to her will, she broke them in other ways, through fines, through restrictions, through the slow, grinding process of making life so frustrating, so exhausting, that leaving felt like the only option. Matt wasn't about to let that happen to him. He started documenting everything. Every interaction, every letter, every ridiculous fine and attempt at harassment. He saved security footage, took screenshots of messages, logged every single conversation with his neighbors that confirmed her long history of targeted intimidation. He knew that winning against someone like Karen wasn't just about proving she was wrong, it was about proving that she was a liability. People like her thrived because they made themselves appear untouchable, but even the most untouchable people had weak points. And Karen's weak point was power. She didn't just enjoy controlling the neighborhood, she needed to control it. It wasn't about enforcing rules, it was about enforcing her version of order. So Matt started hitting her where it hurt. He gathered signatures, carefully and quietly, reaching out to the people who had been wronged by her the most. He didn't lead with anger or accusations, he led with logic, with facts, with a clear and legal pathway to removing her from power. He laid it all out, piece by piece, explaining that this wasn't just about him, that anyone in this neighborhood could be next if Karen decided they didn't fit her standards. And little by little, people started to listen. He knew Karen would catch wind of it sooner or later. She had eyes everywhere, and sure enough, it didn't take long for the pushback to start. The sudden, inexplicable fines for things that had never been issues before. The anonymous complaints about his property, his car, the way he parked in his own driveway. The warnings that if he continued to disrupt the harmony of the community, he could face more severe consequences. It was laughable, really, how transparent it all was. But Karen wasn't just relying on technicalities anymore. She was getting desperate. One night, as Matt checked his security footage, he caught movement near his front door. A figure, hooded, staying just out of range of the brighter lights, but still visible enough that he could make out what they were holding. A bucket. The moment he saw the motion, he was already moving. He threw the door open just as the figure raised their arm, ready to splash something against his house. The pungent smell of paint thinner hit him instantly, even before the first drops hit the pavement. The figure froze for just a second, long enough for Matt to step forward. "Wrong house," Matt said coldly. The figure hesitated for a fraction of a second before dropping the bucket and running. Matt didn't bother chasing them. He didn't need to. The camera had caught everything. By the time he reviewed the footage, he wasn't surprised by what he found. The person hadn't been some random vandal, some bored teenager messing around. No, this had been deliberate, calculated, and even though the hood obscured their face, Matt recognized the build, the way they moved. One of Karen's people. She had escalated to property damage. That was her mistake. Matt had been playing defense, waiting for her to push too far, to make a mistake that could actually cost her something. And now she had. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. This was criminal. Matt wasn't going to report it to the association. He wasn't going to file a complaint through her rigged system. No, this time he was going over her head. Because Karen had finally crossed the line that would end her reign for good. Matt had been waiting for Karen to make a mistake, but he hadn't expected her to be this reckless. The attempted vandalism on his house was more than just an escalation, it was a desperate move, and desperation meant she was starting to feel the pressure. He had been chipping away at her control, gathering support, and proving to the people around him that they didn't have to live under her rule forever. She had built her authority on the idea that no one would ever fight back, that the endless fines, the citations, and the constant harassment would be enough to break anyone who challenged her. But she had never dealt with someone like Matt. The next morning, he went straight to the police. He wasn't expecting much, not because the crime wasn't serious, but because he knew how these things usually went. Without a clear face in the video footage, there was always the chance that it would be dismissed as not enough evidence, or that the case would get buried under more pressing matters. But he also knew that this wasn't just about one act of vandalism. This was part of a pattern, a targeted campaign of harassment and intimidation, and patterns were something law enforcement actually took seriously. He sat across from a detective, laying out everything he had. The security footage, the threatening letters, the manufactured violations, the false reports. He didn't just present it as a single incident, he framed it as a coordinated effort to push him out of his home, an ongoing campaign of deliberate abuse. He knew better than to expect immediate action, but he could tell by the way the detective's expression shifted, by the way they started taking actual notes instead of just nodding along, that he had struck a nerve. That was the thing about people like Karen. They were incredibly careful until they weren't. They knew how to manipulate rules, how to work within systems, but eventually they always got greedy. They always pushed too far, believing that their control was absolute. But control was only absolute until someone exposed the cracks, until someone refused to back down and made them feel the weight of their own actions. When he left the station, he wasn't sure what would come of the report, but he knew one thing for certain: Karen had overplayed her hand. And she knew it too. Because the next escalation came fast. 2 days later, a notice of emergency board action was posted on his front door. It was a formal letter, filled with legal jargon and vague language, but the message was clear: he was now under special review for repeated violations and disturbances within the community. It was nonsense, of course. There were no specific charges, no actual incidents listed, just a blanket statement about how his behavior had been detrimental to the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood, and that he would need to attend a mandatory hearing to determine potential disciplinary measures. Karen was trying to put on a show. She wasn't just looking for a way to punish him, she wanted to humiliate him, to drag him into a public spectacle where she could control the narrative. She wanted him to sit in a room full of people while she listed off every so-called violation, every trumped-up complaint, every ridiculous fine, and make him look like the problem. She wanted him to break in front of everyone. But Matt wasn't walking into a trap without a plan. He spent the next few days gathering his own evidence, making sure that when the hearing came, he would be prepared. He pulled every single fabricated violation, every piece of proof that showed the selective enforcement of rules, and most importantly, the long history of similar harassment against other residents. He didn't just want to defend himself, he wanted to dismantle the entire foundation Karen had built. When the day of the hearing arrived, he walked into the meeting room calm, collected, and fully prepared for war. Karen sat at the head of the long conference table, flanked by her usual allies, the board members, who had either been too weak to challenge her or too complicit to care. She had that same smug expression, the one she always wore when she thought she had already won. "Mr. Collins," she began, her tone sickeningly formal, "we appreciate you taking the time to join us today to address the numerous concerns that have been raised regarding your conduct in the community." Matt didn't respond. He just sat back, arms crossed, watching her. She hesitated for half a second, just a flicker of uncertainty, but then pushed forward. She laid out the case against him, going through a ridiculous list of offenses that were so absurd, so blatantly fabricated, that it took everything in Matt not to laugh. Excessive noise complaints, unauthorized modifications to his property, failure to comply with community guidelines. One by one, she listed them off, painting a picture of him as some unruly, disruptive force that had been terrorizing the neighborhood. And when she finally finished, waiting for him to get defensive, waiting for him to lash out, Matt did the one thing she hadn't expected. He smiled. Then he pulled out his own stack of papers. "That was quite a speech," he said, his voice calm. "But now, let's talk about facts." And then he started going through everything. The inconsistencies in the violations, the pattern of targeted harassment, the clear, documented evidence of how the rules were only enforced against specific people, the security footage of the vandalism attempt, the anonymous reports that conveniently disappeared whenever they didn't serve Karen's interests. And then, finally, he pulled out the signatures. Dozens of them. From residents who had been too afraid to speak up before but who had, in private, confirmed everything he was saying. Karen's expression cracked. The room went silent. The board members, who had been so confident at the start of the meeting, were now exchanging uneasy glances, suddenly realizing that this wasn't the controlled, one-sided attack they had expected. This wasn't just a resident defending himself. This was an exposure of the entire system they had let Karen build. And then Matt delivered the final blow. "Now," he said, leaning forward slightly, "we could continue this hearing, or we could talk about the legal implications of everything I just presented, because I have already filed an official report with law enforcement. And I have more than enough evidence to take this beyond just a neighborhood dispute." Karen's face went pale, because she knew. She knew that if this went any further, she wasn't just going to lose control, she was going to lose everything. For the first time since this whole thing had started, she was the one on defense. And Matt? He was just getting started. Karen had built her power on the assumption that no one would ever fight back. Every ridiculous fine, every fabricated violation, every carefully orchestrated campaign of pressure had been designed to make people feel like they had no choice but to comply or leave. She had gotten away with it for years, bullying residents into submission, using the system as a weapon, and ensuring that anyone who stood against her quickly realized they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. But this time she had miscalculated. This time she had picked a fight with someone who wasn't going to fold. The board meeting had been the turning point, the moment where her carefully crafted illusion of control had finally started to crumble. The expressions on the faces of the board members, the way they had shifted uncomfortably as Matt laid out his case, the sudden absence of the smug certainty that Karen usually radiated it, had been the first real crack in her armor. And cracks only got bigger under pressure. Matt had expected her to retaliate in some way, to try and salvage what was left of her authority, but even he hadn't expected how desperate she would become. Because when she realized that she could no longer win within the system she had built, she abandoned it completely. She stopped pretending. The next day, Matt found a letter in his mailbox. Not an official notice, not one of the usual printed warnings with letterhead and formal language. Just a single sheet of paper, folded once, with his name scrawled on the front in rushed handwriting. Inside it read, "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started." There was no signature, no direct threat, just that single, ominous sentence. But Matt didn't need a signature to know exactly who had written it. Karen had finally dropped the act. Most people would have gone straight to the police, but Matt knew how this game worked. Karen had spent years perfecting the art of plausible deniability. The note itself wasn't enough to prove anything, and she knew it. She wanted him to feel like he had exposed her only for her to remind him that she was still here, still watching, still capable of making his life hell in ways that couldn't be traced back to her. But that was where she had made her final mistake. Because fear only worked if the person on the receiving end still believed that the other side had power, and Matt had stopped believing that the second he saw her lose control in that meeting. He didn't throw the note away. He didn't go to the police. He didn't even acknowledge it. He simply added it to the growing pile of evidence he had been compiling and waited. And sure enough, it didn't take long for Karen's downfall to finally begin. That night he received a phone call. Not from the police, not from one of the board members, but from someone he hadn't expected to ever hear from one of Karen's own people. The voice on the other end was hesitant at first, guarded, but the more they talked, the more the words started spilling out. It was someone from the board, someone who had been quietly following Karen's lead for years but had finally seen the writing on the wall. They admitted that Karen had been pushing them to escalate things against Matt, that she had been furious after the meeting, convinced that he needed to be taught a lesson before he could do any more damage. And then they said the words that Matt had been waiting for. "I think we've had enough. People are turning against her. She's losing control." Karen had built her power by convincing people that she was untouchable, that the system worked for her and against everyone else. But now the people who had once followed her were realizing that she wasn't as invincible as she had made them believe. And the second doubt started to creep in. The second people started to see her as a liability rather than an asset. It was all over. The real collapse came fast after that. The police, who had once been reluctant to get involved in what they saw as a petty neighborhood dispute, suddenly had multiple formal complaints on their hands. Not just from Matt, but from other residents who had finally decided that if one person was willing to stand up to Karen, maybe they could too. And then, the final nail in the coffin. Matt had been watching Karen's movements closely, and in the days following their confrontation, she had been making frequent visits to a property management office on the other side of town. At first he hadn't thought much of it, but then he put the pieces together. She wasn't just trying to hold on to power, she was trying to cut and run. She knew the walls were closing in. She knew the legal action Matt was building had the potential to not just remove her from the board, but expose every shady thing she had done over the years. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was preparing for an escape. So Matt made sure that wouldn't happen. The same lawyer he had been working with to build the case against her was more than happy to tip off the right people about Karen's sudden interest in property management. Within 24 hours, multiple complaints had been formally filed, An emergency board meeting had been scheduled, and Karen was backed into a corner she couldn't escape from. The night before the meeting, Matt saw her standing in her front yard, staring at his house. Not with anger, not with that usual smugness, but with something else. A defeat. She knew it was over. The next morning, the neighborhood gathered in what was supposed to be a final disciplinary hearing for Matt, but when the meeting started, it was Karen who was on trial. One by one, residents stepped forward. People who had been too afraid to speak out before, people who had kept their heads down for years just to avoid her wrath. They told their stories, the fines, the intimidation, the endless, calculated pressure. And with every word, Karen's grip on the community crumbled a little more. By the time Matt presented the final pieces of evidence, the coordinated harassment, the fabricated complaints, the direct attempt to damage his property, it was no longer a question of whether Karen would be removed from the board. It was a question of how quickly they could get her out. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She didn't even try to defend herself. Because she knew she had lost. And Matt, he hadn't just won, he had ended her. Karen was gone, not in some dramatic, explosive way, not in a scene where she screamed and cursed as she was dragged away in disgrace, but in the way that truly ruined people always went down quietly, suddenly like a candle being snuffed out. She had spent years building herself into an untouchable figure, positioning herself at the top of the community's power structure, manipulating the rules, bending them when necessary, breaking them when she thought no one would notice. But power that fragile never lasted. It only worked as long as people believed in it, and once they stopped, once they saw through the illusion, it collapsed under its own weight. Her resignation letter arrived in the association's office first, a formal, impersonal document citing personal reasons for her departure. Then, just days later, the moving truck showed up in her driveway. No announcement, no goodbye, no final attempt to salvage what was left of her reputation. She just packed up and left. Matt watched from his front porch as a handful of hired workers loaded furniture into the truck. He had expected to feel something when this moment came: satisfaction, maybe even triumph, but instead he felt nothing. Karen wasn't worth celebrating. She was just another person who had tried to wield power she didn't deserve and had lost when someone finally pushed back. The neighborhood itself changed faster than he expected. The same board members who had once backed Karen with blind obedience were now scrambling to distance themselves from her legacy, claiming they had never fully agreed with her methods and that they had simply been following procedure. A new election was held, this time with actual community participation, and for the first time in years, people actually had a say in how things were run. The fines, the pointless citations, the endless bureaucratic nonsense, all of it started disappearing overnight. Matt didn't take part in any of it. He didn't run for a position on the board, didn't campaign for the people who were trying to take Karen's place. He had never wanted control. He had never wanted power. He had just wanted to be left the hell alone. And now, for the first time since moving in, he finally was. It was strange how quickly things went back to normal. The tension that had once filled the air, the quiet, simmering resentment that had lingered in the neighborhood for so long, it was just gone. People walked their dogs without fear of being fined for using the wrong kind of leash. Families decorated their houses the way they wanted, without receiving letters about aesthetic violations. Even something as simple as parking in their own driveways felt like an act of quiet victory. One evening, as Matt sat on his back porch, beer in hand, he noticed something he hadn't before. The sounds of the neighborhood had changed. It was livelier, more relaxed. Laughter echoed from a nearby yard where kids were playing. Someone had music playing in the distance, a soft melody drifting through the air. A group of neighbors gathered on a front lawn, talking, joking, existing without fear of being reported for standing too close to the street. And that was when he realized Karen hadn't just controlled rules. She had controlled how people lived. Without her, they were finally free. A knock on his fence pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, expecting to see another letter, another notice, some final piece of leftover nonsense that needed to be dealt with. But instead, it was Tom, the older man who had warned him about Karen when this all started. "You got a minute?" Tom asked. Matt nodded, gesturing for him to come around to the porch. Tom settled into the chair across from him, letting out a tired sigh as he stretched his legs. Been a long time since this place felt like an actual neighborhood, he mused. Matt took a sip of his beer. "Yeah." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Tom turned to him with a knowing look. "You know," he said, "you could have left. Most people would have." Matt didn't answer right away. He had thought about leaving more times than he cared to admit. He had considered packing up, selling the house, walking away from all of it just to avoid the fight. But every time he had, something in him had refused. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about not letting someone else decide how he lived his life. "I don't like being pushed," Matt said finally. Tom chuckled. "Yeah, I figured that out about you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out something folded and worn. A petition. The same one Matt had started weeks ago, the one filled with signatures from people who had been too afraid to fight back on their own. "You started this," Tom said, tapping the paper. "And I think some people around here want to say thanks." Matt frowned. "Thanks for what?" Tom gave him a knowing smile. "For reminding them that they didn't have to just take it." Matt exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He hadn't done this for anyone else. He hadn't done it to be some kind of hero. He had just wanted to live in his own damn house without someone breathing down his neck about every minor decision. But maybe, without realizing it, he had given people something they hadn't had in a long time, the idea that they could push back. Tom stood, stretching with a groan. "Anyway, just wanted to stop by. Let you know people appreciate what you did." Matt nodded, unsure what to say. As Tom made his way toward the fence, he paused, glancing back with a smirk. "And hey," he added, "if you ever feel like drinking another beer in your backyard, don't worry. I think the new board's got better things to do than care about it." Matt snorted, raising his bottle in a mock toast. Tom chuckled, giving a small wave before disappearing down the sidewalk. Matt leaned back in his chair, watching the sky turn shades of deep orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world around him was quiet, peaceful, exactly how it should have been all along. Karen was gone. The war was over. And for the first time since moving in, Matt Collins was finally home.